Yeah, Billy!
He's a runt.
You're saying you'll testify?
Oh, Your Honor, I am not.
Jesus!
Nick Hume is your typical family guy trying to do the right thing in life, no matter how tough things get. He's got a loving wife, Helen, and two sons, Brendan and Lucas. Now, Brendan and Lucas? They're always squabbling over something, but deep down, they've got each other's backs. The Hume family, overall, is tight-knit and full of love. One evening, after one of Brendan's hockey games, Nick and Brendan head home together. Helen and Lucas couldn't make it to the game. On the way, Brendan casually drops some big news. He's considering moving to Canada for college to chase his dream of becoming a pro hockey player. Nick's a little bummed at the idea of his son being far away, but still fully supports Brendan's ambitions. As they're driving, Nick notices a couple of cars zoom past them with their headlights off. Weird, but he brushes it off. A little later, their car runs out of gas, so they pull over at a gas station. While Nick's filling the tank, Brendan goes inside to grab some snacks. Out of nowhere, the same cars from earlier pull up, and a group of masked men rushes into the store, guns in hand. It all escalates fast. The robbers start yelling and demanding cash, and when the cashier tries to reach for a weapon, they shoot him. Brendan freezes in fear, unable to move. Hearing the gunshot, Nick tries to rush inside but gets hit by a car in the process. Things go from bad to worse when one of the robbers, egged on by his partner, suddenly pulls out a machete and slashes Brendan's throat. Nick, horrified, watches helplessly as his son collapses. The robbers take off in their cars, leaving one behind. Nick tackles him to the ground and yanks off his mask, getting a good look at his face before the guy breaks free and runs, only to get hit by a car in the street. Nick rushes to Brendan, who's bleeding heavily, begging for someone to help. They make it to the hospital, but despite the doctor's efforts, Brendan doesn't survive. Helen and Lucas arrive, and the family is shattered by the news. Nick is called to a police lineup to identify the killer. It's Joe Darley, a kid really. The family holds a funeral for Brendan, but moving forward without him proves unbearable. Lucas, especially, struggles, breaking down in Brendan's room one night while staring at a picture of the two of them. Later, Nick meets with his lawyer, who explains that the case against Joe is shaky. No murder weapon, no witnesses, and the gas station had no security cameras. There's talk of a plea deal, which infuriates Nick. He learns that Brendan's death was part of a gang initiation, making it even harder to stomach how little his son's life seemed to matter to these people. During Joe's trial, Nick's rage boils over when he sees Joe smirking at him. In a moment that shocks everyone, Nick retracts his testimony, claiming it was too dark that night to identify the attacker. Joe's delighted and walks free, but Nick can't let it go. He watches Joe leave the courthouse with his friends, celebrating like he's just won the lottery. Something snaps in Nick. He starts tailing their cars, eventually finding himself in a rough part of town. Back at home, Nick digs through a shed, looking for a weapon. Lucas interrupts, wanting to talk about Brendan, but Nick brushes him off, hiding a knife he's wrapped up. Determined, Nick returns to the spot where the gang dropped off Joe. He's trying to calm his nerves when Joe steps outside to toss some trash. Nick confronts him, and things quickly turn violent. Joe tries to fight back, even grabbing Nick's knife, but Nick overpowers him, stabbing Joe in the stomach. Joe dies, and Nick flees the scene, tossing the knife into a river after wiping it clean. When he gets home, Helen notices how disheveled he looks, but Nick brushes it off, saying he fell. That night, he breaks down in the shower, apologizing for failing to protect Brendan. Meanwhile, the gang's leader, Billy, is dealing with his own problems. He delivers money to a higher-up named Bones before returning to the gang's hideout, where he learns about Joe's death. Enraged, Billy vows revenge. One of the gang members mentions seeing a guy in a suit lurking around, and Billy quickly connects the dots. It must have been Nick. Nick is at work when a detective shows up to talk about Joe's murder. Though he keeps his cool, Nick feels some relief knowing Joe is gone. On his way home, Billy and his crew start tailing him. One of them takes a shot at Nick, but he manages to knock the guy down and escape. What follows is a chaotic chase through alleys and parking garages. Nick uses every trick he can think of to lose them, even setting off car alarms to create distractions. At one point, Nick ends up on the rooftop of a parking garage, hiding among the cars. When one of the gang members gets too close, Nick ambushes him. They wrestle, and the fight spills into a parked car. The car starts rolling toward the edge of the roof, but Nick manages to kick out a window and escape just in time. The car crashes to the ground, killing the gangster inside. Exhausted and shaken, Nick gets back to his car and drives off before Billy and the others can catch up. He pulls over on the side of the road, overwhelmed by everything that's happened. Then he gets a call from Helen. Lucas is missing and she's panicking. Nick has a gut feeling about where his son might be. Nick eventually finds Lucas at the gas station where Brendan had been killed. The poor kid is completely broken, sobbing his heart out and drowning in guilt for surviving when his brother didn't. Nick manages to calm him down and takes him back home to Helen. Meanwhile, Billy, the gang leader, is busy digging through Nick's wallet. He finds family pictures inside and starts plotting his revenge against Nick. Nick is in his office when one of Billy's men, Bodie, barges in with a package. Security tries to stop him, but Bodie muscles his way into the elevator and storms into Nick's office, shouting his name. He throws the package onto Nick's desk and delivers a chilling message. Nick and his family are next. Before security drags Bodie out, he makes sure his threat lands. Shaken, Nick opens the package. Inside, he finds his briefcase and pictures of his family. There's also a number written on the back of one photo. When Nick dials it, Billy picks up the phone. The gang leader doesn't hold back, warning Nick that payback is coming because the guy Nick killed was his brother. Nick freaks out. He quickly grabs his things and calls Helen, urging her to stay home and lock everything up. Then, he contacts the detective to report the threat. By the time Nick gets home, there are already cops stationed outside the house. He rushes in and double-checks that every door and window is locked tight. When the detective arrives, she drops a bombshell in front of Helen. She tells her that Nick has stirred up a dangerous mess by killing Billy's brother. Helen is shocked, but Nick doesn't admit to anything. Instead, he asks the detective for help. She agrees and leaves the cops to guard their home for the night. Later, Helen confronts Nick, demanding answers. He finally opens up, admitting that all he could think about was avenging Brendan's death. He breaks down, telling her he just couldn't let it go. Helen, trying to keep the family together, reassures him that no matter what happens, he's a good father, and she'll always love him. That night, chaos strikes. Billy and his gang ambush the house. They kill the cops outside and storm in, guns blazing. Nick tries to fight back, tripping one intruder in the bathroom and tackling another over the railing. But things quickly spiral out of control. Billy's men grab Helen and Lucas, dragging them downstairs where Billy is waiting. Nick, barely recovering from his fall, sees Billy gun down both Helen and Lucas right before shooting Nick too. Nick wakes up in the hospital, disoriented and screaming for his family. He passes out again, only to wake up later with a detective standing over him. She warns him that his quest for vengeance has gotten him nowhere but hurt. At first, Nick thinks his entire family is gone, but the detective reveals that Lucas is still alive, though barely holding on. Nick rushes to Lucas's hospital room and finds his son in a coma. Overcome with guilt, Nick sits by his side, apologizing for all the times he treated him differently from Brendan. He breaks down, telling Lucas how much he loves him and regrets not protecting him. Something changes in Nick. When the detective steps out for a moment, Nick vanishes. He heads home, gets changed, and calls in a favor from a friend to trace Billy's location. Then he goes to the bank, empties his accounts, and prepares for his next move. Nick tracks down Billy's location by roughing up a bartender at a shady bar. The bartender spills the address, and Nick heads straight to Billy's boss, Bones, who's known for dealing in weapons. Flashing cash, Nick convinces Bones to sell him an arsenal of guns. Before Nick leaves, Bones casually mentions that Billy is his son. However, Bones doesn't seem to care about the family connection and sends Nick off to finish what he started. Back at home, Nick gears up for his showdown. He shaves his head, loads his weapons, and sets out to find Billy and his gang. Nick bursts into the hideout of one of Billy's goons, taking him out and forcing him to call Billy. As soon as Billy picks up, Nick kills the goon mid-call, sending a message loud and clear. Meanwhile, Billy returns to his father, Bones, blaming him for allowing Nick to buy weapons. The argument escalates, and in a fit of rage, Billy shoots Bones dead, stealing his car to make his escape. Nick tracks Billy to his gang's hideout. He crashes through the gates in his car, smashing into a van and killing one of the gang members. Armed and ready, Nick storms the building, taking out gangsters left and right in a violent shootout. Billy and his right-hand man, Bodie, join the hunt for Nick, creeping through the darkened hideout. Nick proves to be a tough match. He takes down several men in intense, close-quarters fights. At one point, he blows off Billy's fingers during a brutal exchange. Bodhi manages to shoot Nick in the neck, but Nick retaliates with a perfect headshot, taking Bodhi out for good. The final showdown between Nick and Billy is raw and chaotic. Both men are badly injured and running on fumes. As they exchange gunfire, Nick manages to fatally wound Billy. The two end up sitting on a bench, both on the verge of death. Billy, gasping for breath, tells Nick that he's turned into the very thing he was fighting against. Nick, unmoved, pulls out his revolver and asks Billy if he's ready to die. With tears in his eyes, Billy nods, and Nick finishes him off. Afterward, Nick takes Billy's car and drives home. Exhausted and bleeding out, he collapses onto the couch just as the police arrive outside. He watches an old video of his family, his eyes filling with tears. The detective finds him and tells him that Lucas is going to survive. Hearing this, Nick finally allows himself to relax. With a faint smile, he takes his last breath, the image of his family in his mind as everything fades to black.